Good morning. Welcome to the Long Live Alternative Parties podcast. Free Press Media Press Inc., an alternative parties books publisher, sponsors this podcast. I'm Andrew Bouchard. Welcome to Long Live Alternative Parties podcast. Today, friends, we have another exciting guest on our podcast. It looks like the Idaho Libertarian Party is up to exciting things. We recently interviewed the District 2 U.S. Congressional Congress candidate from the Idaho Libertarian Party, and today we're interviewing the District 1 candidate. His name is Matt Loesby, and he has some exciting stuff to tell us about today. So welcome to the podcast, Matt.
Thank you for having me, Andrew.
Matt, if we could get started by you kindly giving us an introduction to yourself, a brief biographical sketch.
Sure. So I was born in the early 1990s in Colorado, and my parents raised me in the Denver area. I was doing pretty well in school, but I was always a little bit of a punk kid, and it just so happened that in the 2000s we had a bunch of really terrible things happen in the political sphere, starting out with 9/11, going into the financial crash, all the wars, and as I was just looking at the world, I just got interested in politics, interested in economics. I ended up reading a few books that were a big influence on me: Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress by Robert A. Heinlein, and I also watched an interesting rap battle between a fictionalized John Maynard Keynes and Friedrich Hayek, made by Econ Stories. And those sort of set me on the path of loving liberty. I also was playing a bunch of video games, and so I went into video game development as a career. Went to California, got a degree, and I've been working in the video game industry as a software engineer for about 12 years now. But during that time, of course, we all lived through the 2010s, and unfortunately, things did not go well. And so as things got toward 2018 to 2020, I started getting involved with the Libertarian Party, trying to turn it into a really effective force for liberty in American politics, because the Democrats and the Republicans just keep eroding our freedoms. So in 2018, I left California, and I moved around the country a little bit before settling in Idaho, because this is just a really great state to live in. And I got involved with the Libertarian Party of Idaho, and now I'm running as a candidate because I want Idaho to be able to be Idaho and not be messed with by the federal government and by all the various tyrants who have tried to destroy our society over the past 20 years.
Wow, that's a great introduction. So I applaud you for reading all of Atlas Shrugged. That is no small novel. My record is reading it in 1 week. I don't think I slept, but I enjoy reading quite a bit. Wow, so that book seized your soul then, in other words.
For a little while.
Awesome. I know that rap battle you're talking about, and that gives a lot of food for thought. The other book I've never heard of, what's that called again?
The Moon is a Harsh Mistress by Robert A. Heinlein. It's a sci-fi novel based on, imagine if the moon were Australia, but 200 years later. And the main plot of the story is essentially a prison riot by the entire moon.
Oh, my.
Yeah.
Interesting.
It's got some very interesting political theory and philosophy in there that's just a lot of fun to consider, like a lot of Robert Heinlein's books have.
Oh, sure. So you mentioned that you're in the video game industry. How has that informed your political views?
Well, so one thing that I've seen being in video games is that just demographically, a lot of the people who end up developing video games end up being politically progressive. There's psychological reasons for that, and I was always a bit of an odd man out, but it was no problem. People can disagree in good faith and have a good time. As politics has gotten worse and more extreme, a lot of people have felt more and more of a need to insert their politics into video games, and so that's been a major cultural struggle just in the video game subculture. And so that sort of shaped some of how I view the struggles in our modern society. As far as the kind of skills I've developed and how that relates to politics, so I'm a software engineer, and that involves reading a lot of code, figuring out what it does, figuring out the things that it's doing wrong or badly, improving it or changing it for new goals. And over the past couple of years, I've been reading just about every law that goes through the Idaho Congress. And
Oh, wow.
I've found that it's basically the same task in a different language. Instead of C++, it's in legalese.
Wow.
And so, I'll be reading through a piece of legislation and say, you know what, that is a bug. That needs to be fixed, which it's a fun way to apply the mindset that I've been working on for over a decade.
That sounds like it. So in regard to video games, it's interesting that you mentioned you see a lot of them as progressive, because I remember I've studied Gamergate and I've made comments on that, and it seems like a lot of people there was the progressive people inserting themselves, yet there's a lot of people in the video game. So is it the video game developers that are progressive, yet the video game fans are not so progressive, or how does that work given Gamergate context versus your observations?
Yeah, so generally the people making video games are majority progressive politically. There are people like me, there are conservative people as well, but the majority are political progressives. Gamers themselves come from all walks of life, but the most dedicated gamers tend to be young men, usually people with a little bit more money to spend, so they tend to be a little bit more libertarian or right-wing than the average person, but it's still a very broad audience. And so, what my philosophy when it comes to game development is you can have themes that speak to parts of the human experience, including politics in your game, and it's not distracting because it's fiction, it's exploring the human experience.
Sure.
The thing that Gamergate got kicked off because of corruption in the video game journalism industry, but the broader movement over the past decade has sort of evolved into, we're just sick of modern politics infiltrating everything. So, you can say, all right, we've got this setting in, for example, Helldivers 2. The setting is very clearly a satire on American foreign policy in the 21st century, spreading managed democracy throughout the galaxy. And, you can notice it, but it's well written and it's funny, and so it's not bothersome. Whereas just inserting a character who has a particular identity trait and not writing them very well, just making it very obvious that you were checking a box, that puts gamers off, it distracts people from the experience, and so it's bad for the game and it's a bad idea to do. So that's sort of how I think about the industry. But
Interesting. Okay. So we interviewed your colleague, your friend with the Idaho Libertarian Party. He represented one side of Idaho. He's talking about the demographics of that. If you could kindly share the demographics of your side of Idaho, that would be awesome.
Yeah, so they're very similar. So my district is basically the west side of Idaho, going from Nevada to Canada. And, it's as far as racial demographics, it's more interesting to talk about how much of the population is German versus English versus Swedish than it is any other demographics. We do have a fair amount of Hispanic, Mexican generations descended from immigrants who largely came in to work the farms. Economically speaking, it is almost all farmland, ranch land, and mountains, with just a couple cities. My district does not contain any of Boise itself, but it's most of the county around Boise. And we also have Coeur d'Alene. So one set of suburbs of a large city, medium-large city, and one medium-sized city. But almost everything else is small towns, rural districts, all that kind of thing. And then the one interesting difference between Todd's and my district is that his district has a much larger Mormon population because it's closer to Salt Lake City.
Okay, yeah, interesting. I recall him saying that Idaho is a big red state and that applies to his district, so I assume that applies to your district as well, correct?
It does, even more so, in fact.
Oh, wow. Oh, interesting.
Yeah, in the 2022 race for District 1, Russ Fulcher, who's the incumbent, won against Kaylee Peterson, who is the Democrat, by 55 points.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that is a big margin.
Mm-hmm.
So what issues that affect your district or that you care about in general are you bringing to this race? What are your main platform planks?
Well, so my core platform planks are less policy and more philosophy.
Okay.
And so my number one slogan is stop doing evil, because the United States federal government, almost across the board, takes our money and spends it on doing evil things here at home and around the world. And it just needs to stop doing that so that people can actually fix the problems in their own lives, which they know how to do and no bureaucrat in Washington does. As far as issues, the things I'm really focused on are foreign wars, the national debt, and immigration.
Okay.
And my solution to all three of those is sort of combined. What we need to do is we need to stop sending our money overseas to foreign governments. We need to bring all of our troops home because they are not deployed to active war zones. They're deployed to a bunch of conflict zones that Congress never declared. So they can just come home. And what we can do is we can station them on the border and at ports of entry to defend our country against people who are trying to retaliate for all of the evil things that the neocons have convinced America to do over the past 6 decades. And that would save us a lot of money, and we could focus instead on trying to reduce our deficit, trying to draw down welfare transfer payments so that the government can actually have a balanced budget, we can cut taxes, and people can have their own money and live their own lives.
Okay. So you mentioned immigration. What is your view on that? Are you an open borders type of guy, or do you have a different policy for immigration?
I'm not an open borders type of guy. There are libertarians who are that way, and we have a disagreement. I am in what you might call the Hoppian camp, where I think that the only people who should be allowed into the country are citizens and people who are invited by citizens, as well as tourists for a short period. And then the citizens who invite people take responsibility for those people if they incur debts, if they commit crimes. The citizens are on the hook for any financial costs related to that. And so then it's not, the government saying, okay, you're approved, you're not approved, you're approved, you're not approved, having the big bureaucracy and doing a bunch of investigations all over the country and violating our rights. It's people saying, I believe that you will be good to bring into this country to, for example, work on my farm. I have confidence that you're not going to commit any crimes, that you're a good hard worker, that you'll do a good job, and then you'll go home and everything will be great. And so they invite them in, and then they come in, and ideally, everything works out as planned. And then if something goes wrong, then the person who invited that person, if that immigrant committed a crime, then the person who invited them has some responsibility. And so then they have a very strong incentive to make sure that they're inviting good people. And there are plenty of good people to bring in. And so we can just distribute the screening process across those who are actually really motivated to bring people in. And then we don't have this massive tyranny.
Okay. So part of my ignorance, I haven't heard an immigration policy stated quite like that. It seems like it's a polarizing thing where there's people on one side that are open borders, and then there are people who are xenophobic that don't want anyone in. So this seems to be somewhere in the middle of those two. Would you say that's an accurate assessment of that?
It's funny to hear it called in the middle or moderate, because Hans Hermann Hoppe is generally regarded as a total radical. So I'm kind of glad to hear you characterize it that way. Hans Hermann Hoppe is the economist who came up with the idea.
Oh, okay, interesting.
Yeah, so I don't generally think about things in terms of trying to be between extremes. I just try to say, okay, what is ethically, morally, and responsibly correct to do, and let's just do that. And so if the correct thing appears extreme to somebody, then that's fine. I don't particularly care one way or the other. If it appears moderate to people, cool.
Okay. So with this program, I'm understanding it, the people who are citizens, they can vouch for non-citizens, and then they can have them come in. Would there be any limits what they could do? Could people have hundreds of people they invite in, or would some of the other things that are used to screen immigrants still be applied?
No limitations, but there would probably be some nominal registration fee just because the government does need to keep track of, okay, who has invited whom and such like that. And so there would be a little bit of limitation just with regard to doing the bare amounts of paperwork that would be involved there. But no hard numerical limits. It's just how many people are you willing to take responsibility for taking the risk that one of them might turn out to be poorly screened, might turn out to be a criminal, something like that.
Okay. Okay, you mentioned also about sending our troops home, getting them out of all these areas they call conflict zones, not war zones. So I would assume that would also, a corollary of that would be you don't believe we should have sending money for foreign aid to other countries. Is that correct?
That's correct. I think that individuals are perfectly free to send their own resources or even go and fight themselves in foreign wars that they think there is a very clear good and evil in.
Okay.
I don't think the government has any right to take our money and force us to do it.
Okay. So that makes me think of something else. That I was reading the Constitution lately. I read this book that was the entire constitutional text, and if I recall correctly, there was a provision in the Constitution that says an individual citizen cannot join a foreign army. So would you change that part of the Constitution so that individual citizens can go fight for other armies, and that way we avoid all the big military stuff we have?
I'm not remembering that exact part of the Constitution, but if it's in there, then yeah, I would change that to say, it's your natural right to associate with a foreign army. It's treason if you join an army to fight against the United States in a war. But if the United States is not involved, as we shouldn't be, then there's no conflict there. So I would amend the Constitution if possible to get rid of anything that prevented people from volunteering to fight for someone else's army against an uninvolved, disinterested party.
Okay. Now, also in regard to bringing the troops home, would you have a gradual phasing process to get them out of there, or would you take them out immediately?
I would begin the process of withdrawal so that all the civilians who are there as support staff to the military get out first, then all the equipment, then the soldiers, so that we avoid the debacle that happened when Biden delayed the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and then the Taliban said, okay, well, Afghans, you can't trust the Americans, you can't trust their puppets, you can trust us, so we're just going to take the country and take all the stuff they left behind. So we want to avoid that situation. But just a responsible withdrawal saying, all right, Germany, we're on these bases, we're withdrawing from these bases, we'll sell you the bases, we're taking our stuff, we're taking our people.
Okay, sounds good. So it would be less of an issue in areas that are not actively at war, like Germany versus Afghanistan, which was at war, where they made major problems to the United States.
Exactly, yeah. And I think that had the original date been stuck to, which I think was May 1st, then things would have gone much better because it would have been before the fighting season, and the Taliban would have had a less strong case that the Afghan government was just an American puppet.
Okay, sounds good. So how are you getting the word out in this race? How are you communicating with the voters?
So I've been doing primarily social media on Twitter, on Facebook. However, I'm just about to start a tour of county seats in the north part of the state. I'm going to be visiting 13 county seats over the course of the next 2 weeks to just meet local libertarians and build out my campaign and get some local expertise about how to reach people in the more rural parts of the state that I've driven through but never really spent a lot of time in. So that's going to be a big deal. And I've also been doing some local events. This past Wednesday, I was at the College of Idaho. There was a candidate forum, mostly for state senate and state house candidates. But my opponent, Kaylee Peterson, and I were on the stage together at the same time, just answering questions brought by the moderator. So that was pretty fun. And, we'll keep doing that whenever the opportunities arise. Okay,
sounds good. So she was open to debating you? She didn't feel it was beneath her?
I wouldn't categorize it exactly as a debate because we weren't so much addressing each other as just answering questions in a panel. It was called the Candidates Forum, I think was the title of it. But because of the dynamics of this district, Kaylee Peterson and I are in about the same position with regard to the election. It's a very hard uphill road for us to win. Her, because she has very progressive social views, which she holds honestly, and I don't judge her for, but not a lot of Idahoans hold those views, and many of them consider them a turnoff. So she has a hard time getting votes, and I have a hard time getting my name out there. So we're both in a pretty similar position with regard to voters. Russ Fulcher was invited, but he did consider it beneath him.
Oh, okay, so he didn't think it was helpful for his election campaign.
Exactly.
Okay, interesting. So since your state is, the population is small versus the size, it sounds like it would be hard to reach a lot of the voters in it, but it sounds like you're going to make a good effort at doing what you can.
Absolutely, yeah. And, going to local community leaders and locals who just know the area, that definitely helps things because in those rural areas, a lot more people know each other, whereas I live in the suburbs of Boise and I know a few of my neighbors, but very few of them.
Good point, good point. Good point. So you've been talking to some of the people already. What have they been saying? What are their perspectives and what are their interests of the people you've talked to already?
Well, the number one thing I hear about is immigration. And
Okay.
it's no surprise. It's been in the news and people are extremely worried about just the sheer volume and the cultural impact, the economic impact. And so that is absolutely the number one thing. And then the other thing is less an issue and more just a feeling. People are just sick of the Democrats and Republicans. And, a lot of the time they won't even be able to articulate an issue. Someone will say, "Oh, and thank you for running against Russ Fulcher." What is your problem with him? "Oh, it's just, I don't know, I'm just sick of him." And people feel emotionally a lot more than they think rationally, and so it makes total sense that that's the case. But just offering an alternative that is reasonable, that recognizes the problems that these people have caused us over the past 20 years and even the past 150 years, and saying, "Hey, you don't have to vote for evil. You can vote to stop doing evil." That has been a pretty good message for me so far in all the conversations I've had. So I'm pretty excited. We'll see what the race can do. Yeah.
Excellent. So, Matt, how can our audience support you in your campaign?
So the most important thing for people living in Idaho is I need campaign volunteers to spread the word, to go knock on doors, to tell me how to reach people in their area. So that is the most important. And so if you go to loesby.us, LOESBY.us, I have links to volunteer for the campaign, and also donations are appreciated. They'll be spent on things like social media advertising, signs, and getting events set up, that sort of thing.
Okay, sounds good. So, Matt, we thank you for coming on the podcast today. We appreciated hearing about your exciting campaign and your interesting views on things.
Well, thank you, Andrew. It was a pleasure.
We wish you all the best in your campaign and also everything you do in your personal and professional life.
Have a great day. Thank you.
Bye now.